Is this thing on? Yeah, so I guess this video starts with me just talking right now to myself. Um, at least there's a hypothetical audience and I'm not just going for it, you know? Uh, what you're looking at is the leftovers of a run that could have been world record, but I was fucking stupid. And tried to do an experiment in the middle of a totally valid run. Tools, state manager. Oh, is this it? No. Yeah. Excuse me. Excuse you. A lot of earthquake. There we go. Already recording. No lots of stuff. Doing game. Stream title. Playing game. Play game. Stream title. Play game. Go live notification. Video game. Category. Earthbound. No. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Yes, no. Nah, retro. Category, retro. There we go. Okay. Play game, video game, retro, English, sensitivity warning. We're recording. And we're live.
Hello. Today in the Loopcast, we're in conversation with Jessica Pishko, the author of The Highest Land in the Law: How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. It is fantastic. It is for somebody who studies extremism as much as we do on the show. It was very enlightening and scary. It's highly recommended to go buy the book. We'll have a link to The Highest Law in the Land in the show's description, and you can go purchase it from there. So why have a discussion on the constitutional sheriff movement? I think a big theme of our series on lawful extremism has been this idea that all extremist politics are local, and by extension all laws and law enforcement that embrace extremist ideas would start locally. The constitutional sheriff movement is a good example of this. And what I wanted to highlight here is that one of the concepts going into this conversation is the idea of states' rights. It's not just a legal concept, it's something of a meme in right-wing circles. The call to states' rights simultaneously limits the federal government and also demands the expansion of local power within a framework of conservative thought. And if we take a step back, that dynamic isn't just limited to the constitutional sheriff's movement. Rather, it is something that repeats itself within conservative and right-wing thought, from the defense of slavery to the overthrow of Reconstruction to the maintenance of segregation and Jim Crow, and now, in our time, immigration and abortion law. So, with all that being said, please welcome my guest, Jessica Petishko. How's it going?
It's great to be here.
Awesome. I want to start off with, it's going to come off as a basic question, but it's something that I found myself asking as I was listening to the audiobook and reading the book, which is, what are constitutional sheriffs? What are constitutional sheriffs, and how do they differ from regular sheriffs?
I think that's a really good and important question to start with. So just to start with sheriffs generally as a class, so sheriffs are elected law enforcement officers, and they are elected by the residents of a county. So the sheriff is voted in by county, which means that regardless of the population of that county, so if you have 200 people or 2 million people, you get one sheriff. And so that's how the sheriff is elected. It's usually an at-large election. And there's only one per county, and there are over 3,000 in the country. So we're talking a pretty decent number of sheriffs. There's a handful of states that don't have sheriffs for various reasons, but almost every state has a sheriff. So that said, to go on to talk about what a constitutional sheriff is, because I think it's useful to have in mind like what kind of law enforcement office we're talking about, just as a general matter. So constitutional sheriff is the word that some of these people give themselves. And I sometimes use the word far-right sheriff for various reasons, mostly because the word constitutional can be very intentionally confusing for people, because it sounds like it means that the sheriffs are in the Constitution, which is not true. Now, the sheriffs who agree with at least some or most of the ideas behind the constitutional sheriff movement, in essence, argue that because they are elected law enforcement officers on a county level, that this means that they have a supreme authority when it comes to deciding what laws to enforce and how those laws should be enforced. Now that said, that sounds a little bit what police discretion is every day, right? So police every day don't arrest every single jaywalker. Or if you've been pulled over for speeding, you don't get a ticket every single time, right? So what distinguishes constitutional sheriffs from what we might call the exercise of regular discretion by all law enforcement is that constitutional sheriffs believe that they are only enforcing laws that correspond with the U.S. Constitution, by which they mean the first 10 amendments. So that said, their aims are really specific. It's about freedom of religion, by which they mean freedom to go to church. This is a big deal, right? So more religion in everyday life. Second Amendment rights. So basically an unfettered right to own firearms. Property rights. So the idea that if you own property, you can do whatever you want with it, regardless of like environmental regulations, etc. And the 10th Amendment, which is the amendment that's usually used to make a states' rights argument. So this idea that like states and counties can nullify or overrule federal government laws that they don't like or that they feel are not being enforced well. And that includes, for example, sheriffs and local law enforcement enforcing immigration law. So the idea that if the federal government is not properly enforcing immigration law, it is constitutional for the sheriff to step into it himself.
Oh no, did I? Oh.
Hello.
A supreme authority when it comes to deciding what laws to enforce and how those laws should be enforced. Now that said, that sounds a little bit what police discretion is every day, right? So police every day don't arrest every single jaywalker. Or if you've been pulled over for speeding, you don't get a ticket every single time, right? So this So what distinguishes constitutional sheriffs from what we might call the exercise of regular discretion by all law enforcement is that constitutional sheriffs believe that they are only enforcing laws that correspond with the U.S. Constitution, by which they mean the first 10 amendments. So that said, their aims are really specific. It's about freedom of religion, by which they mean freedom to go to church. This is a big deal, right? So more religion in everyday life. Second Amendment rights, so basically an unfettered right to own firearms. Property rights, so the idea that if you own property, you could do whatever you want with it, regardless of like environmental regulations, etc. And the 10th Amendment, which is the amendment that's usually used to make a states' rights argument. So this idea that like states and counties can nullify or overrule federal government laws that they don't like or that they feel are not being enforced well. And that includes, for example, sheriffs and local law enforcement enforcing immigration law. So the idea that if the federal government is not properly enforcing immigration law, it is constitutional for the sheriff to step in and do it himself. So what I would say is that the thing that differentiates these far right sheriffs, what you might call ordinary discretion, is the fact that they have these like very specific policy goals, right? Their policy goals align with the far right. And they, for example, oppose abortion rights, they oppose LGBTQ equality rights, they don't, for example, consider the 14th Amendment as part of the Constitution, so the Due Process Amendment, the Reconstruction Amendments, right? These are not amendments that they consider important enough. So that's why I say sheriffs do have a lot of powers, and all law enforcement does, to decide how they will enforce laws on a day-to-day basis. But what we're talking about here is the far-right sheriff movement that is interpreting certain laws in a very specific way.
So I want to examine their interpretation of the Constitution. I find it very interesting because they're looking for the first 10 amendments, or the first 10, but ignoring the Reconstruction Amendments, which I'm assuming it's the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th amendments, if we want to be broad. So, digging a little deeper, how do we understand this kind of intentional choice of looking to the founding Constitution, and how do they misinterpret it, or not just misinterpretation, but selective emphasis of the Constitution and the ideas in that document?
Yes, so I think that's really important to understand that when they say they're following the Constitution, that they are doing it in an extremely specific way. Now, that is much more familiar, I think, to most people, given that we have one political party that is essentially doing almost the same thing, right? So this is one of the presidential candidates that are doing, and what the GOP is arguing. So I do think that it's because in general we say, oh, everything should be constitutional, right? We all agree that the Constitution is good, following the Constitution is a good idea. So I think it can strike some people as, oh, this seems totally fine. And yeah, so what this is
we have
really
the world
rooted
record on
in
attempt
is,
69.
to make it the long and the short of it,
Have
it's
to.
rooted in ideas of states' rights. And most people will remember or think back to the last time we heard really robust arguments about states' rights was during the time of school decertification.
Okay, cool.
And so when Brown v. Board of Education was issued by the Supreme Court, southern states and counties rebelled against that decision and refused, in essence, to desegregate their schools. And there were a series of other things that happened, right? The Supreme Court said, no, you actually really have to desegregate. We weren't just kidding. And then eventually we know that National Guard troops had to be sent in to force them to desegregate, right? So this was not like a small thing. This was a big thing. And the idea behind it, their legal justification, was this justification of, in essence, nullification, which was the idea that if the Supreme Court or the federal government created a law or issued a ruling that they felt did not comport with their interpretation of the Constitution, which again was the first 10 amendments, that this meant that they were justified, and not just justified, but in fact required to not follow it, right? It was their obligation and duty to resist things like desegregation. And so that is the root of where the ideology comes from. Now, what I will say is that constitutional sheriffs themselves, particularly the current incarnation of the movement, will resist that and say that it's not, that desegregation is an unfair comparison because they are not explicitly racist, which is true. I would add, though, that they are extremely xenophobic and anti-immigrant, so that a lot of the rhetoric that would have been, I think, dedicated towards Black Americans is now being targeted towards what they would call like non-citizens. And so I do think that's the direction where that hostility has been pointed at. But I do think it's worthwhile to remember that they are not.
Split. This time we wait. The green flash 474763. Okay. And 4666. 9 down 1. Okay, and split. This got very stupid. $420. I'll take a 420. If I ever stop being lazy about what's that thing? Is Hawk? I should find out if skip sandwiches are faster. Okay. That was easy, but what? We can still get a new record on attempt 69. Would it be beat if I didn't forget what I was counting to, going from 474 to 763? I used to go from 47 to 50, so like 1, 2, 3, 10, 10, 6, but you can just do 10, 10, 9 and be normal. Okay. So that's best untainted PB. Sort of a record. Where were we?
Thinking of the rights of women, the rights of minority populations, or other groups of people that, for we lawyers would say, require the protection of the Constitution, right? Like, one of the arguments for the Reconstruction Amendments and other parts of the Constitution is that they are intended to protect what might be minority groups from like the tyranny of sort of white supremacy.
The use of nullification is interesting to me because they're trying to deny that they're not racist, but a simple kind of tracing the roots of nullification, as you've already pointed out, it goes back to segregation, desegregation, and even, back to pre-Civil War times. So I'm curious then, how do we consider, or how do we understand historical interpretation and understanding within the constitutional sheriff movement? Is there an attempt to rewrite history, or is it just simply editing it out and expressing it as they see fit?
I think that the constitutional sheriff movement, and this makes a lot of sense, right? So one thing I will say is that
It's
the
crazy.
main bulk of the constitutional sheriff movement is driven by an ex-sheriff named Richard Mack, who was an Arizona sheriff, and his group is called the Constitutional Sheriff and Peace Officers Association. And
Okay.
while he's not the only group that is identified as a constitutional sheriff group, it is the main one. And so a lot of what they do is sets the template for the constitutional sheriff movement. But I think that one of the reasons why the movement has endured, right? Richard Mack became famous in the 1990s when he was one of a handful of sheriffs who sued the Clinton administration over certain provisions of the Brady handgun bill. The Brady handgun bill was one of an early, basically, gun legislation. It mandated background checks, and a handful of sheriffs were recruited by the National Rifle Association to sue the Clinton administration over the implementation of this bill, and they won. So it was a decision written by Antonin Scalia,
Crazy.
and Clarence Thomas wrote a concurrence, and sort of was also setting the template up for the way Second Amendment jurisprudence is today, in addition. But that case was in the 1990s, and I think that after, for example, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which was a far-right militia-inspired act of domestic terrorism, and other things, and other kind of crackdowns on basically far-right types of violence, that Richard Mack himself thought that for this constitutional sheriff movement to keep going, it needed to evolve, right? So he couldn't have the same movement that you might have had in like the 1990s. And one of the ways in which he decided to evolve was to cast it as something like a civil rights movement. And so by
Sorry.
specifically saying that racism was not a part of the movement, by casting away this links to the Southern strategy, links to desegregation and white supremacy, by casting it away and in fact embracing ideas like icons like Rosa Parks, which is something I talk quite a lot in the book about, how he adopts the icon of Rosa Parks, the civil rights icon who has been used and misused in many ways. He wants to set constitutional sheriffs, again, as a line of civil rights, right? This is civil rights, and this is a form of civil rights that is specifically, honestly, for white people. Like, I've started calling this a little bit like civil rights for white people. It's very similar to these lawsuits we have today decrying affirmative action as racist to white people. These lawsuits and movements we have that are a bit about what people call reverse racism. And so that is what the idea that the constitutional sheriffs are trying to tap into. And that's an idea that has shown to be really popular, right? So while I think, in my view, that people don't want to really identify as white supremacists or secessionists, they have an easier time identifying with what is in essence kind of colorblind civil rights, or the idea that there's a civil rights movement that in some way is not really examining the role of race, which sounds like bizarre and profane, but right, that is what they are arguing, right? They are arguing that civil rights, in fact, is the gun owner. Richard Mack has a great sort of speech where he talks about Rosa Parks, the gun owner, Rosa Parks, the property owner, right? Rosa Parks, who just wants the government to leave her alone. Rosa Parks, who doesn't want to pay taxes, right? That's another one. The idea that, like, that the civil rights movement was actually a movement to get government out of people's lives, right? And this sort of is what are the co-optations of this kind of colorblind idea. Now, in fact, the reason why, I say it's a little profane is that the ask of Rosa Parks and the ask of the civil rights movement was not for the government to get out of people's lives. It was for the government to come and stop white supremacy, right? The ask was, federal government, can you enforce our right to vote? Can you enforce due process? Can you make sure that segregation isn't happening? That was the ask of the civil rights movement. The ask was not like a leave us alone ask.
There's this, in addition to nullification, there's this other concept that you discuss in the book that was new to me, which is this idea of interposition. And curious if we can explore this idea, because I think nullification, for a historian, there's enough kind of antecedents and kind of sources to go through and figure out what they mean by nullification, but interposition was really new to me. Could we go through and try to understand that concept?
Sure. So I think they do sound unusual because, like I said, it's not real law. Everyone has been, the Supreme Court and other courts have been very clear that this is not valid law. So I think that's why it sounds unusual. And I do think, nullification is making a comeback, right? If you look at what Texas is doing, the whole state of Texas is doing, right? It's in essence a form of nullification. Interposition is nullification's friend. So the idea of interposition is that local authorities can stand between or interpose between their citizens or residents and the federal government. And the way this plays out is something to the effect of, okay, the way to enforce gun regulations is maybe for the ATF to come, or if you're not paying your taxes, the IRS will come, right? The IRS will get upset with you, and the IRS might eventually come to your door and arrest you if you fail to pay your taxes for long enough. The idea of interposition is that the sheriff can act as a law enforcement authority who will, in essence, protect you as the citizen from the IRS or from the ATF or from the FBI. So sheriffs make this claim that federal law enforcement can't come into the county without asking the sheriff for permission. And this is this idea that if the FBI wants to come to my house because they think I made a threat against the president, that the federal law enforcement has to first go to the county sheriff before they come to your house or something like that. And that is born of this idea, to be honest, one of the roots of this idea is the idea that the federal law enforcement is dangerous and to be feared. This again goes back to far-right militia ideas in the 1990s. So if people think about some of these events in the 1990s that really radicalized the far, one of them was sometimes called the standoff at Ruby Ridge, right? And at Ruby Ridge, a white supremacist, basically a survivalist white supremacist, had barricaded himself. He was on top of a mountain. He lived with his family. The ATF wanted to arrest him because he had violated a firearm regulation, and also the FBI wanted him to be an informant into the Aryan Nation. He did not show up for his court hearing, so they sent U.S. Marshals to go get him. Now, in the process, there ended up being a multi-day standoff. Members of his family were killed, so his wife and infant were accidentally shot and killed by snipers from the federal government. And so when this was all over, what the far right saw was that a federal government came to go after an individual who was on top of a mountain, who didn't want to respond to a subpoena to come to court, and that the federal government had shot and killed members of his family. And when constitutional sheriffs kind of take this idea and say, that seems bad, and then shortly a year after that, there was, of course, the Waco, the Branch Davidian event, which I grew up in Texas, so this was a very big deal, right, where federal law enforcement, in essence, bombed the Waco compound. Many children were killed, so a lot of people were killed, and so this created the fear that, the federal government's going to come and use their weapons and hurt people. The idea of interposition would be that sheriffs would, if the sheriff had been allowed to intercede, if in Waco this local county sheriff had been permitted to mediate with the Branch Davidians, that this violence might not have occurred. And this is why Richard Beck will sometimes call sheriffs, quote, the peaceful solution. because sheriffs, had they been permitted to intercede, would have prevented this kind of like federal raid that ended up with a lot of people killed.
So then, when taken in tandem, nullification and interposition, would it be fair to say that those kind of concepts are leveraged to basically ignore federal law or kind of reject federal law? Because I'm trying to understand how we can relate those two concepts to the view of this movement on immigration, abortion, and gun rights. Is it like a wholesale rejection of federal authority, or is it selective? How do they relate
So,
nullification and interposition to real political issues?
So I think that the way they see it it is in essence saying that we won't enforce certain laws, and beyond that, that we won't allow the federal government to enforce them either, or the state. So the way this sort of acts out, like a good example, and when the constitutional sheriffs got their read was during COVID. So COVID was an example of when state governments, many state governments, implemented health rules about mask wearing, limiting the size of gatherings, closing businesses, etc. So a lot of health rules were put into place, and constitutional sheriffs were called upon basically to make it okay for people to disobey those rules, right? People did not want to wear masks, they did not want schools closed, they did not want businesses closed, and so we saw a lot of, in essence, rebellion, right? People opened their businesses in certain places, people held maskless rallies, right? These were forms of rebellion against laws, and constitutional sheriffs came in and said, hey, you know what? We already know how to do this. We will help you because we will nullify those laws and interpose. So let's say your business is open and the state will send someone to close your business. We will tell the state that they can't go, right? We're going to prevent the state from enforcing its law. We'll prevent the federal government from enforcing its law. So yes, it is a matter of saying both, right? We support your right to rebel and not follow these laws that to us are unjust, right? And we are going to make sure nobody else can do it too, right? Because if you remember, right, desegregation happened because the National Guard came. So what is interposition? That's the sheriff saying, we're just not gonna let the National Guard come in some way. We will prevent the National Guard from coming.
In something like immigration, where the examples you use in the book is sheriffs, county sheriffs, or constitutional sheriffs are taking that extra step. You know, for instance, Joe Arpaio, I think his name was. In that sense, could we explore when this movement finds the federal government's role insufficient, and then they take it upon themselves to enforce or over-enforce, or I don't even know the verb for it, make up their own laws? I don't know.
It's a little bit of both. And this is also why I refrain from calling constitutional sheriffs an anti-government movement. Now, I can understand why some people do, because a lot of their activity is opposing federal agencies. Again, like targets they love to hate are the IRS, the ATF, the FBI. Again, these are also things that a Trump administration has promised to eliminate, right? So it's also, this is now, we're a more mainstream contested idea about the role of federal agencies. But in reality, they're not necessarily anti-government so much as they have very specific ideas of what government should do. And yes, I agree. So to think about Joe Arpaio, who really became like one of the most famous constitutional sheriffs, I want to say that Richard Mack's affiliation, his group, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, really was not that popular until Joe Arpaio came and became a really good avatar for constitutional sheriffs. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that Joe Arpaio was just on TV all the time. If you remember, when he was in his heyday, he was in the news everywhere. And two, that he had a much larger county. So it is true that constitutional sheriffs, worth bearing in mind, tend to be sheriffs in places that are simply not urban. right? They tend to flourish in places that are more rural. Richard Mack was a rural sheriff, right? His heart is in rural areas, and that's where they do their most recruiting. Joe Arpaio is the sheriff of Maricopa County. Maricopa County is the most populous county in Arizona. It's a huge county with a lot of people. So this is a big deal, right? To get someone who's a really important sheriff who believes in these constitutional sheriff ideas. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Joe Arpaio could not have done what he did without the Arizona and the state legislature helping him, right? Joe Arpaio was able to over enforce immigration law because Arizona passed a law called SB 1070, which allowed, in essence, state law enforcement officials to enforce immigration law through essentially racial profiling, right? So the rule became you can enforce immigration law by making traffic stops of people who look brown, and then you can arrest those people if you think they might be immigrants, and then we can process them and put them into deportation proceedings, right? And this is the main way that it operated. And yes, so indeed, one of the appeals to Joe Arpaio to constitutional sheriffs, like where they shared, was one, anti-immigrant animus, right? Quite frankly, just the idea that it was okay to racially profile immigrants. And two, the idea that it was important for a county sheriff to enforce immigration laws because that was protecting the county. Now, of course, the rub there is that Maricopa County itself is a very large percent Latino community. It belies the nature of the constitutional sheriff movement, right? Because they will say, "Oh, I'm protecting my residents." But the question is, what residents are you protecting, right? Joe Arpaio argued he was protecting residents of his county from immigrants who might commit crimes. Of course, that is eliding the fact that most of the people in his county were Latino and were related to immigrants, right? In some way, shape, or form, or who
Cool.
just cared about immigrants, right? Ignoring it was actually
Pause. Oh. Never mind, not cool. Yeah. 2:30. Took too long.
is yes, and this is where I say, look, it's a far right movement. The idea that immigrants, particularly again immigrants of color, are to be feared, are to be excluded, are to be arrested. That's just quite simply like a far right idea, right? That's an idea that the United States is a country of white people. And then I will point out similarly when there's a concern about firearm regulation, right? So sometimes the other popular place where constitutional sheriffs pop up is to say, we don't like this gun rule, this gun law, we are not going to enforce it. I would point out that one of the things they don't say is the vast majority of people in almost every state who are in prison are young black men arrested for firearm violations, right? There's a lot of people in prison right now who are serving time because of firearm violations, most of them for possession or committing crimes while you're in the possession of a firearm. I would say that constitutional sheriffs have not taken that up as a cause. And the reason why they have not taken that up as a cause is that most of those people are not white. Right? These are people in the mass incarceration system. These constitutional sheriffs want to have it both ways, right? They want to say that they're colorblind, but I would point out that all of their ideas that they're emphasizing, the people that they say are their constituents, right? These are white people. These are not like communities of color.
Something that I found interesting was going through the book, it, to your point, becomes immediately apparent about the focus of constitutional sheriffs on immigration law and laws around firearms. But in our other conversations about lawful extremism, the topic of abortion has come up over and over again. And I'm curious, how does the constitutional sheriff movement think about abortion. To be clear, when I say abortion, it's not just the procedure, but the surrounding issues. If something like SB 8 in Texas or similar legislation. But going back to the original question, how does the constitutional sheriff movement think about abortion and kind of banning it or allowing it?
So they are distinctly anti-abortion. There's no question. They oppose, and I agree with you. There's a few different versions, right? There's SB8. There's also going to be the issue of what I would call like travel, the right to travel to get abortions, which is where I think constitutional sheriffs will pose the most issues, simply because that is a spot where pulling people over and car stops can come into play, is through this idea of traveling to get abortion care. But yeah, so it is quite clear. Constitutional sheriffs to a T oppose abortion rights. Absolutely, regardless of the idea that people
Okay.
should be free. There's an idea, right? People should be free to do what they want, et cetera, unless you're a woman. And this is really because the constitutional sheriff movement has a lot of crossover with what people are now calling Christian nationalism. Now, Christian nationalism, I think, has changed a bit because Richard Mack and his constitutional sheriff movement is really rooted in Mormonism, right? He is a Mormon. A lot of his ideas are rooted in Mormon extremists that came out of the anti-communist movement. So basically, the birth of the far right is from this anti-communist movement. Now, what has happened today is that kind of extreme Mormon movement and what we might call like the evangelical movement, white evangelical movement, have merged and agree on a number of issues. Not completely, but in, I think, the more recent years, they've discovered that politically they have a lot more in common, to being things like disagreeing on a dislike of abortion, wanting to roll back gay marriage rights, that sort of thing. So this is where it comes from, right? It is a religious root. This is a very specific belief in the Bible, belief that the Ten Commandments should be in schools, belief that this is a Christian nation, etc. So that's where the abortion rights comes in. It's very, again, and this is why I call it like a far right movement, because I do resist. Sometimes people say, oh, laws they don't like, but it just so happens the laws they don't happen to fall along an extremely specific ideological spectrum, right? And one which, yeah, the researcher Jan Bergen calls lawful extremism, this idea that what they're doing is some version of lawful extremism.
So something that really jumped out at me, and you touched on it in your answer, is the role of Mormonism. Like, it was surprising to me because I think in the course of our shows, we've examined Protestantism and how an extremist kind of interpretation of it played into the Second Klan, extremist Catholicism, and Mormonism just jumped out at me. And I'm curious to explore that root a bit. How much did an extremist interpretation of Mormonism play into the roots of this movement, and whether was it more the extremist interpretation of religion or anti-communism, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, it's really an unholy combination of all those things, right? I agree, and I do think that a lot of talk about Christian nationalism has really emphasized Protestants, and now we have this sort of rise of the far right Catholic kind of push, which people have been focusing on. But yeah, really, this, what I would call like extreme Mormonism, it does come out of very similar roots, the anti-communist roots. During the 60s, in this sort of wave of anti-communism, a number of leaders of the Mormon Church similarly adopted strong anti-communist sympathies that were along the lines of the John Birch Society and other kind of far-right ideas. Now, the interesting thing a little bit about these far-right Mormon thinkers was that Mormons were not necessarily welcome in all these spaces. As you point out, like the second incarnation of the Klan was very much a Protestant movement. They did not welcome Mormons into that movement. And so they created a little bit of their own far right extreme movement. I do want to say that the Mormon Church has like officially said that this is not part of the mainstream Mormon Church. So I want to say that I talk about it in the 60s and 70s and even 80s. These figures were a part of the Mormon Church and they were in mainstream Mormon institutions. But the Mormon Church has been pretty clear in their own statements this is not something they agree with. But from the 60s, this anti-communism, there was a thinker, his name was Cleon Skousen, who I talk about quite a bit in the book. And Cleon Skousen had connections to Mormon leaders, right? He was connected to Ezra Taft Benson, who was a very important Mormon leader. He was one of their member of the council, their top. I was calling them a crew. I don't know if Mormons would agree with that. Their top group of sort of Mormon leaders. And Cleon Skousen was like a really influential anti-communist thinker. He was the author of several books. He was also very widely read by Mormon extremists and politicians. So, for example, Mitt Romney is familiar with those works. Rick Perry was familiar with it. Glenn Beck promoted Cleon Skousen's books. Also, people who were influenced by Skousen, who are also Mormons, is Stuart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers. And if some people, if the name Ammon Bundy rings a bell, right? The Bundy family, who has had at this point 2 standoffs with federal law enforcement, they are also Mormon and influenced by this extreme right-wing Mormonism in the West. Particularly these sections of the West, this is a very important ideology that motivates a lot of far-right thinking. And Cleon Skousen's basic idea was that every law enforcement officer should be anti-communist. That it was really important to train law enforcement to, I think he said, like, sniff out communists wherever they go. And people, this was, again, really common everywhere, up and down the law enforcement totem pole. Like, it was popular with the FBI, it was popular locally, it was, like, universally popular to have this idea that there were, like, communists hiding about. And Skousen tried to do a program where he tried to basically plant informants to get rid of the communists that he thought were at the Mormon University, and which now I just spaced out on, which now I apologize. Brigham Young. So he had this idea that there were like secret communists at Brigham Young, and he implemented basically like a string of student snitches to snitch on communist discourse at Brigham Young. Which this all seems a little silly, but this was like very serious. And this is where Richard Mack came from, right? He came from steeped in this ideology and steeped in very religious Mormonism. This idea that what law enforcement needs to be really concerned about is rooting out the far left. Like, where are the far lefties? Where are the communists? Where are the socialists? And you can interpret this now too, right? Like, where are sniffing out? Where are the immigrants? Where are the Black Lives Matter activists? Where are the student protesters? And this idea is really the basis of constitutional sheriff ideology. I do think that one of the things that has happened, again, because Mormons were not always welcome in traditional Protestant spaces. Neither were Catholics either. Like, you couldn't have Catholics in the Klan either, which is why they had their own Klan. So because of that, but I do think what we've seen in recent years is that the interest of all of these kind of extreme religious ideologies in the United States have created, they have like more in common. And this, I think, really happened during the Tea Party era, where a lot of far-right groups, right, started to find each other, including groups like Stuart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers and militias, also like the Three Percenters. They all realized that they had like common cause, because they all were very concerned with what they saw as like the leftward move of the country, which they represented by the first Black president, Barack Obama.
That's our time. Oh, shoot. Gotta retime it. Bind reset to a different key now, huh? Okay. What attempt is that? 71? 71. 71. At least now I'll be able to find it. Make sure it shows up in OBS. Yeah, okay. That's awkward. That's a little better. Okay. Onward. No, actually. Okay. We gotta get a sub 4.
And this idea that they needed to create a grassroots far right movement to push back against this. So I do think it is interesting because we talk about Christian nationalism now, but I think it's interesting to see that the roots of it, if you talk to like religious scholars, these are different roots, right? Protestants did not necessarily want Mormons in their places, and actually for a long time Mormons couldn't even join the John Birch Society, which is weird to be like, oh, why won't the John Birchers be more accepting of other religions? That was the problem, right? They didn't, and so that was like Cleon Skousen had his own thing going on. Now, a generation later, they did, right? So there are relatives of Skousen who were prominent John Birchers. But this ideology has been really important in the West, and it's still, I mean, it really still is around, right? You periodically hear about, again, the Bundy family. If people aren't familiar, Ammon Bundy is a rancher who lived in Nevada. He refused to pay his grazing fees and had a very large standoff with the federal government, at which point they backed down. They basically went home and did not try to collect his cattle and his fees. I always point out that his fees were something like in excess of millions of dollars. So it wasn't like he owed like $5 to the federal government, like he owed millions. He had not paid grazing fees in 2 decades. The federal government had spent a lot of time trying to get him to pay through other means. They were going to go seize his cattle. And that's when the Oath Keepers and the modern militia movement all showed up, chased away the federal government back down, and that kind of gave them, what invigorated the movement. It showed them that they could get the federal government to back down with a display of force. And I think to a lot of scholars, this is something that gave a lot of force to the kind of Mormon extremism, but also the constitutional sheriff movement, which is very much wrapped into this whole thing.
Interesting. So I want to maybe examine another route that you bring up in the book, which is the role of William Potter Gale. And I'm curious, first, how do we understand his influence on what would become the constitutional sheriff movement? And then is there a broader kind of thread here about Christian nationalism and white supremacy?
So I think that William Potter Gale is a good coinciding of Christian nationalism and white supremacy. And look, one of the things I do want to say about William Potter Gale is you could start the discussion of this kind of melding of Christianity and white supremacy in a few different places, right? William Potter Gale came from the brown shirts, and they begat others who followed down the same line. But William Potter Gale is generally credited with creating a movement that he called Posse Comitatus. There's actually a little bit of dispute about who created it, so we can let them fight about it when they're not alive. They could fight about it if they want. But the general idea is that William Potter Gale is an interesting guy. He was born Jewish. He moved to Southern California. He became what was called a Christian identity minister. Christian identity is just basically white supremacy as a religion. I don't go into it a ton in the book, but they have a sort of idea that white people are the original Israelites, and they have a biblical justification for white supremacy. But the end of the day is that they rationalize white supremacy through religion. And he was a self-ordained minister, of course, because they didn't really have a church. But basically, he started to do a variety of things that the far right was doing at the time, namely newsletters and radio shows, right? The sort of social media of the day. And one of the things that William Potter Gale started to promote was white Christian men forming what he called posses. And they were groups of white Christian men. They wore little stars. They called themselves the Sheriff's Posse Comitatus. And the idea was that these guys, these self-appointed posses, were something like vigilante committees. They were basically groups of vigilantes who were entitled to enforce the law. And the Posse Comitatus movement, I want to be clear, was actually pretty small, and they were also very violent. So they gained a reputation for, in essence, being heavily armed, showing up in various places heavily armed, right? So they would show up at, let's say they were evicting farmers in the Midwest, they would show up armed. They would show up in, I think, fields in Stockton, California, protesting unionization. So there were people trying to unionize the workers. They showed up to protest unionization. They showed up at various other kind of land projects like mining and such things. And law enforcement did not like them. They were heavily armed militia groups who saw themselves as entitled to enforce the law. Now, they believed that the sheriff was the only legitimate law enforcement officer. But I have to say that during the time of Posse Comitatus, not a lot of sheriffs bought what they were selling. There just were not a lot of sheriffs who were into it, but they would approach the sheriff and say, hey, we have a militia and we're going to go do this stuff. Don't you think we're great? And let the sheriff respond. And so a lot of their activity, to be honest, now is the militia movement today, right? They are groups of armed men. They believe they are entitled to enforce the law, and they believe, in essence, that the county sheriff is their friend. And this is still true, right? Many militias now could just go to their county sheriff and say, hey, we're going to show up at this protest. We're going to stage a counter protest. Is that cool? We're just trying to help you guys out, create extra security, acting as auxiliary sheriff's deputies or something like that. And so that is really where I think a lot of people will say Posse Comitatus is the root of the constitutional sheriff movement, and it's the root of also the militia movement and sovereign citizens movement. So they really all come from the same primordial goo, right, of the idea that citizens, more specifically white male Christian citizens, are entitled to, not just entitled to, but like required. Like the Constitution requires them to go out and enforce the law in this particular way, which is why I think the ideology is sticky. Like it has a lot of resonance with people because it's not just saying, "Oh, you should." It's like your duty as a Christian American is you must. Like you must stop this federal government intrusion. You must not allow women to get abortions, right? We must not allow gay marriage. And so that is, I think, why the movement but stays right, it keeps bubbling up, it stays popular because it is something that people believe is their duty, not as kind of both Americans and as Christians, which is where I think we bring in this Christian national strain, which has the idea that there is an obligation, like a holy obligation to enforce these laws, which I do think makes it hard to talk people out of, right? You can't really talk people out of an idea that like they believe is their duty given to them by a deity that they believe in very strongly.
Interesting. So I want to maybe take a sidestep here, and we're recording this conversation on November 4th, and tomorrow is obviously election day across the nation, and I'm curious, since these constitutional sheriffs are elected, what is their role in elections? And then are there any races that we should be on the lookout for tomorrow?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, I do have thoughts of races for tomorrow. I think that of recent years, since 2020, the constitutional sheriff movement and many members of it have really gotten on board with this idea of like election integrity. I have a whole chapter on it in the book. It's worth mentioning. It is plainly one of the ideas that they've really latched onto that deeply aligns them with that. And they have gotten indeed more purchase by aligning themselves with people like Michael Flynn, Patrick Byrne, the My Pillow guy, right? They've aligned themselves with all these sort of election deniers. And the constitutional sheriffs believe that one of their, again, sacred duties is to protect American elections, to protect the vote. And their focus right now, well, their focus has been in the past on voting machines, creating distrust among like how the voting is carried out. This year, it looks like one of their main themes is going to be a concern about non-citizen voting. We already see them setting this up, and it does create like a union between distrust of immigrants, right, and distrust of elections to create this narrative that we need to be worried about non-citizen voting because this is something that the left has been doing on purpose, right? The left is recruiting people of color to vote because that's how they're going to retain power. And so I do think that one of the things I and many people are thinking a lot about is on election day and after, what will be the role of sheriffs and the types of people they motivate, which is basically militia style groups. As I talked about, they have this ongoing connection with militia style groups that they tend to use when they need to, right? They used it, for example, in 2020 when there were a lot of Black Lives Matter protests. Sheriffs united with militia groups in essence to counter protest and to frighten and chase away what they saw as Black Lives Matter protesters, in many cases of which they were small groups of young people, very similar to what I think is the student protesters, the pro-Palestine student protesters on college campuses, which have become another boogeyman, I think, for the right and for law enforcement. Very similar, kind of young, multicultural groups of young people, right? That's very alarming to these far-right groups. So I am thinking about this and what sheriffs will do. I want to say officially sheriffs have no role in elections. They're not supposed to have a role. The only thing they are maybe supposed to do is in some places if you're a poll worker and you're getting threatened, for example, what usually happens is someone starts a fight with you should be able to call your local law enforcement to prevent injury and prevent people from getting hurt. That's the only goal, but the law enforcement, including sheriffs, really don't have a role in elections. They're not supposed to. We have election workers who do that. They're very competent at what they do, so there's not really anything for sheriffs to do. That aside, sheriffs, I think, believe that they have the right to interfere in elections, particularly if they believe they can point to some sort of misdeed, which there's a sheriff in Michigan named Dar Leaf who has been doggedly pursuing what he considers election fraud since 2020. Now, that said, actually, you asked about elections, and I will point out a handful of, there are sheriff elections that I think are worth being a little concerned about on top of the presidential election. There is a sheriff election in Tarrant County, Texas, which is where Fort Worth is. It's an interesting election because Fort Worth, Texas is a little bit of a purple county. The sheriff there is currently a sheriff who is deeply aligned with the constitutional sheriff movement. He is facing a challenger who is running as a Democrat. The challenger is also a black man, which is very rare for sheriffs. Only about 3% of sheriffs are black men. And so I think a lot of people are watching to see what happens in this election. The sheriff there in Fort Worth has a lot of anti-immigrant animus. He has a lot of links to Christian nationalists. He was a fellow with the Claremont Institute, to also point to where his politics lie. So he has spent a lot of time aligning himself with like far-right national political movements, and I think that's something the citizens of his county are very concerned with. That's one of the more important elections I can think of that's ongoing, that really is like a constitutional sheriff that people are trying to unseat.
What is the scale of these electoral contests? Are we talking about millions of dollars being poured into ad buys, door knocking, or is it just the scale is much smaller and we should think about these contests as more within the scale of a state or county oriented campaign, like at the hundreds of thousands of dollars at most?
They're usually pretty small money amounts. I will say this, to buy a sheriff campaign is actually not a ton of money, and that's one of the things that's interesting about all like down ballot. This is true of many down ballot races. Like there's not as much money flying around. Now, I will say, so Sheriff Bill Wayborn, I was looking to see, he gets a lot of money from like outside groups, like far right PACs, but not nearly in the amounts that you would. So, for example, his early fundraising amounts were $50,000. So we are really talking like tens of thousands of dollars, like nowhere near like millions. But in some ways, that's what makes it easy to dominate with outside funding. So that has happened in honestly, both. Like people talk a lot about like the Soros elected prosecutors and sheriffs, and that indeed how Joe Arpaio got outvoted was from outside funding from people who were Democrats to vote out Joe Arpaio. So what's interesting, because the money is not a lot. There's a county in South Texas where another place, very small amounts of money, where there's a Democrat sheriff who's fairly conservative, but he's very much disliked by the Republican establishment because he is a Democrat. They're trying to unseat him with a Republican sheriff, and there the money amounts are really, like I said, tens of thousands, because the incumbent sheriff there, I think he hardly has any funding at all. He's basically running like his own campaign. Right? He's sending like his family members to knock on doors. His opponent has a little more money, but it's like pretty easy to outspend someone, right, whose campaign staff is like his siblings. So like we're talking very small money amounts, which is one of the things that's very interesting about these elections. They're not big elections. They don't get a lot of attention as a general rule. Down ballot races in general don't get a lot of attention. Sheriffs are also, in general, incumbents tend to win a lot. The incumbency advantage for sheriffs is very high. Most sheriff elections aren't even contested. Oh, I was going to point the other sheriff election that's going on is the Maricopa sheriff election, where Joe Arpaio's chief lieutenant is running as a Republican sheriff, promising to bring back Joe Arpaio's policies. And he aligns himself with the constitutional sheriff movement, so that is alarming. Something for people to watch. So I am watching that one to see. I don't think he's projected to win, but I'm pretty concerned about the fact that someone is specifically running to bring back Joe Arpaio's policies, given that Joe Arpaio was supposed to go to prison for his policies. We will see.
Awesome.
That's my comment. We will see. I'm hoping not, but I think it's alarming. I think the thing that I have seen more common is like people running as constitutional sheriffs. That was really uncommon before 2020. Nobody was running like I'm a constitutional sheriff. Sometimes, but really rare. But now we're seeing it more. And again, to see like Joe Arpaio's chief lieutenant running in Maricopa County, the biggest, most populous county in Arizona, that is something that is like hard to ignore, right? That means that it's got enough purchase that people voted for him in the primary.
Interesting. So we've had a fantastic conversation today, and per tradition, we usually end the show by asking you the legendary last question, which is give us something to think about, to chew on before we adjourn for the day. Usually in the past, people have given us recipes, told us scary stories, highlighted a future project. This is truly your space to end the show with, so to speak. So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, interesting. Okay, here's what I will give a future project here. I'll give something that I'm chewing on, which is that what I have seen on a local level is this sort of local science denialism. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is local counties who have created their own health boards to, in essence, nullify state health ideas. So let's say, so they passed the law, let's say a new law is passed, updating vaccines for school. Counties have formed their own health boards to nullify those new vaccine requirements, which strikes me as, are we entering an era of like full nullification on things that I didn't think were possible, which is something like vaccine rules. I just didn't think that I would see that.
Oh man, that's scary.
That's both it's both a horror story and something.
With all that, again, that was our guest today was Jessica Pishko, author of Highest Law in the Land: How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Go get it. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Hello. Today.
Nope. I'm only doing one episode a day. For now. I'm gonna take it up to 80 attempts and then call it for now. I do have like a unequivocally valid Mother 2 run now, so probably done streaming on this channel. Also, I'm probably gonna have to change the name. That's okay. Jeff is in an okay spot. I think I took too long. So many of those in Mother 2. I think 340x is like just barely possible with a save file in the hotel. I don't know why my sum of best looks like that. Like I look at the numbers and I literally don't know. But this program is just awesome. Oh, huh. Okay. One more. Thanks for all the marbles. After this, I'm gonna go retime that new PB. wish I could gold that split every time. No. Please, please, please. Please, 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 please. I'll be so nice, please. Please, please. Yes. Oh, hell yeah. Hell yeah. Oh god. Why did I do that? I pressed it too early. Oh, wait, what? Oh, it's just a normal reset. I got so excited. That would have been like a 157 or something. Yeah, so what's everyone been up to? Was it tantalizing? That would have been sub 4 minute. Poo poo. But at least it wasn't a real soft reset because I didn't wait for the green flash. How do you press? Oh. Okay. That's it for now.